Some folks spend their whole lives searching for something they can't name, a purpose that seems to drift just beyond their reach, like morning mist. For Elias McCready, that search led him deep into Montana's wilderness, where a man can find peace in the company of towering pines and his faithful dog. After 40 years in these mountains, Elias thought he'd seen everything the land had to offer. That October morning started like any other, with Bramble sniffing around fallen logs, while Elias checked his traps. But when his dog started digging at something in the forest floor, everything changed. Two thick iron pipes stuck up through the earth, clean and unmarked by time. When Elias listened close, he heard a strange humming sound coming from deep underground. The pipes weren't connected to any mine or water line he'd ever seen. What was buried down there, humming like the heart of the mountain itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence of the high country had always been Elias McCready's closest companion, second only to the rust-colored hound who now stood alert beside those peculiar pipes. At 63, Elias bore the weathered look of a man who'd chosen the hard path, deep lines carved by mountain wind, hands scarred from a lifetime of honest work, and eyes that still held the clear blue of glacial melt. His beard, more silver than brown now, caught the morning light filtering through the canopy of lodgepole pines that had watched over this valley since before his grandfather's time. Bramble whined softly. His ears pricked forward as he circled the strange protrusions. The dog had been with Elias for 8 years now, found as a pup, half frozen in a snowdrift during a particularly brutal winter. Together, they'd carved out a life in these mountains that most folks would call lonely, but Elias had never seen it that way. The wilderness spoke to those who knew how to listen, and he'd been listening for 4 decades. His cabin sat 2 miles east, nestled in a grove of aspen trees near a clear running creek that had never failed him, not even in the driest summers. It was a simple structure, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and seasoned himself. Inside, the walls held the accumulated treasures of a man who measured wealth differently than most, a collection of arrowheads found along old hunting trails, pressed flowers from alpine meadows, a shelf of books worn smooth from reading by lamplight. Above his stone fireplace hung a faded photograph of his father and grandfather, both miners who'd worked these mountains when the promise of gold still drew men from across the country. The McCready family had deep roots in these peaks. His great-grandfather had arrived in 1889, following rumors of silver veins that supposedly ran like highways through the rock. 3 generations of McCreadys had worked the mountain, each learning that the land gave up its secrets reluctantly and only to those who approached with respect. His father, Thomas, had spent 30 years pulling copper and zinc from a claim up near Copper Ridge, enough to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads, but never enough to make them rich. When Thomas passed 15 years ago, he'd left Elias more than just the mining claims. He'd left him the accumulated wisdom of men who understood that the mountain was not something to be conquered, but something to be partnered with. "The land'll provide," Thomas had always said, "but only if you listen more than you take." Elias had followed that advice, working small claims, hunting only what he needed, and trading his surplus with the few other mountain folk who still called this country home. There was Joe Whitehorse, a Blackfeet elder who ran a small ranch in the valley below, and Martha Crenshaw, a widow who'd maintained her late husband's cabin with stubborn determination. Then there was young Billy Morrison, barely 30, who'd come up from Billings 5 years back, running from some trouble that he'd never fully explained, but that Elias had never pressed him about. Mountains had a way of healing wounded souls, given time. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, lay 47 miles down a winding mountain road that turned treacherous with the first snow. Elias made the trip maybe 6 times a year, loading his old Ford pickup with pelts, handcrafted items, and the small nuggets of gold he still occasionally found in the streams. He'd trade for supplies, pick up his mail at the post office, and exchange pleasantries with folks who regarded him with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Most couldn't understand why a man would choose such isolation, but Elias had learned long ago that explanations were wasted on those who'd never felt the mountain's pull. His daily routine rarely varied. Up before dawn, coffee brewed strong and black over the wood stove. Then out to check the small vegetable garden he coaxed from the rocky soil each summer. After that, he'd walk his trap lines, looking for the signs that told him where the beaver were building, where the mink were hunting, where the fox were denning. Bramble would range ahead, nose to the ground, occasionally flushing a grouse or tree squirrel, but always returning to Elias's side when called. Afternoons were for maintenance, splitting wood, mending gear, cleaning pelts, or working on whatever project demanded attention. He'd built most of his furniture by hand, crafted his own tools when store-bought ones proved inadequate, and developed an intuitive understanding of what the mountain would and wouldn't tolerate. Evenings meant reading by lamplight, sometimes writing in the leather-bound journal he'd kept for 20 years, recording observations about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the subtle changes that marked the passage of seasons. It was a life that required constant attention to detail, where a small mistake could mean the difference between comfort and suffering, between life and death when the winter storms rolled in. But it was also a life that offered rewards that couldn't be measured in dollars. The satisfaction of self-reliance, the peace that came from sleeping under stars that seemed close enough to touch, the deep contentment of belonging somewhere completely. Now, standing beside these mysterious pipes, Elias felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine uncertainty. In 4 decades on the mountain, he'd encountered old mining equipment, forgotten survey markers, even the rusted remains of a Model T that some fool had tried to drive up an impossible trail back in the 20s. But nothing like this. The pipes were made of iron, thick-walled and substantial, but they showed no signs of corrosion. The metal had an unusual blue-black finish that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dappled sunlight. More troubling was the sound. When he pressed his ear to the metal, the humming became more pronounced, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to follow no pattern he could identify. It wasn't the sound of water moving through pipes, nor the whistle of wind through a hollow space. It was something else entirely, something that made the hair on his neck stand up and caused Bramble to pace nervously around the perimeter of the small clearing. The pipes emerged from the earth at a slight angle, suggesting they continued underground for some distance. The forest floor around them showed no signs of recent digging, no indication that anyone had been working in this area. The leaf litter was undisturbed, except where Bramble had scratched at it, and the surrounding trees showed no evidence of heavy equipment having passed through. Elias walked slowly around the pipes, examining them from every angle. Each was roughly 6 inches in diameter, and they stood about 3 feet apart. The tops were sealed with what appeared to be brass fittings, but these too showed no weathering. It was as if the entire apparatus had been placed there yesterday. Yet something about the way the earth had settled around the base suggested they'd been here for a very long time. He'd heard stories, of course. Old-timers in Cedar Falls sometimes spoke of strange things found in the mountains. Equipment that didn't belong to any known mining operation. Structures that predated the first European settlements, sounds and lights that had no explanation. Most folks dismissed such talk as the rambling of men who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness, but Elias had always listened carefully. The mountain kept its secrets, but it sometimes offered clues to those who paid attention. His grandfather had once told him about a prospector named Heinrich Voss, a German immigrant who'd worked a claim up near Glacier Lake in the 1920s. Voss had reportedly found something unusual in his diggings. Not gold or silver, but metal objects of unknown origin and purpose. The story went that Voss had tried to bring his findings to the attention of authorities, but no one would listen. He'd eventually packed up his discovery and left the area, never to be seen again. Most folks figured Voss had simply moved on to more promising territory, But Elias's grandfather had always wondered if there was more to the story. Standing here now, with the mysterious humming filling his ears and Bramble's anxious whines echoing through the trees, Elias began to wonder if old Heinrich Voss might have stumbled onto something after all. The question was whether he, Elias Macready, was ready to follow that trail wherever it might lead, even if it meant confronting mysteries that had been buried for reasons he couldn't yet understand. 3 days passed before Elias could bring himself to return to the pipes. The humming had followed him home that first evening, not in his ears, but in his memory, a persistent rhythm that interrupted his sleep and distracted him from his daily routines. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was probably just old mining equipment, maybe part of a forgotten water system from the logging days. But deep down, he knew better. Bramble had been restless too, whining at the door and pacing through the cabin at odd hours. The dog's unease only reinforced Elias's growing conviction that whatever lay beneath those pipes was significant and possibly dangerous. On the third morning, he finally accepted that he wouldn't find peace until he understood what he'd discovered. He loaded his pack with basic tools, a short-handled shovel, a pickaxe, a pry bar, and his grandfather's old mining headlamp. To these he added rope, a first aid kit, and enough water and food for a full day's work. Whatever was down there had waited this long. It could wait until he was properly prepared. The October air carried the sharp promise of winter as he and Bramble made their way back through the forest. The aspen leaves had turned brilliant gold, and they rustled overhead like whispered warnings. When they reached the clearing, Elias was struck again by how out of place the pipes looked, too clean, too purposeful, like monuments in a forgotten cemetery. He began digging carefully around the base of the first pipe, working in measured strokes that wouldn't disturb whatever lay beneath more than necessary. The soil came away easily, revealing more of the pipe's length. After an hour of work, he'd exposed nearly 4 feet of the metal cylinder, and still it continued deeper into the earth. That's when he found the first artifact. Wrapped around the pipe at about the 3-foot mark was a metal band inscribed, with symbols that made Elias's blood run cold. The markings weren't Native American pictographs, which he'd learned to recognize from Joe Whitehorse. They weren't the crude scratches of miners marking their claims. These symbols were precise, geometric, and utterly foreign, angular shapes that seemed to shift and change when he looked at them from different angles. The metal band was made of the same unusual iron as the pipes, and it bore the same resistant finish. But more disturbing than its appearance was the way it felt under his fingers. The metal was warm to the touch, despite being buried in the cold earth, and it seemed to vibrate with the same rhythm as the humming that emanated from deep below. Elias sat back on his heels, studying the symbols, while Bramble sniffed anxiously around the excavation. In 40 years of mountain living, he'd developed a healthy respect for things he didn't understand. The wilderness was full of mysteries, animal behaviors that defied explanation, weather patterns that seemed to operate outside natural law, places where compasses spun wildly and electronics failed without cause. But this felt different. This felt intentional, as if someone or something had deliberately placed these pipes here for a specific purpose. He resumed digging, working more carefully now, treating the excavation like an archaeological site rather than a simple construction project. The second pipe revealed similar markings at the same depth, and Elias noticed that the symbols on both bands seemed to correspond to each other, as if they were part of a larger pattern or message. By midday, he'd exposed nearly 6 feet of both pipes, and his excitement had given way to profound unease. The pipes showed no signs of ending. They continued straight down into the earth with mechanical precision. More troubling was the gradual increase in the humming sound. What had been barely audible at ground level was now a steady drone that seemed to resonate. In his chest cavity, Bramble had retreated to the edge of the clearing and now watched the proceedings with obvious distress. The dog's ears were flat against his head, and he occasionally whined in a way that Elias had only heard during severe thunderstorms. Animals possessed instincts that humans had long since abandoned, and Bramble's behavior was sending a clear message. Whatever lay beneath the earth was something to be feared. It was while taking a water break that Elias noticed the change in the forest around him. The normal sounds of wildlife had ceased completely. No bird calls echoed through the trees. No squirrels chattered in the branches overhead. No insects buzzed among the dying wildflowers. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, leaving an oppressive silence broken only by the increasingly insistent humming from below. That's when he saw the light, deep in the excavation, where the pipes disappeared into darkness. A faint glow had begun to emanate from the metal itself. It started as barely perceptible brightening, like the first hint of dawn on the horizon, but gradually intensified until the pipes cast an eerie blue radiance upward through the hole he'd dug. Elias scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. In all his years on the mountain, through encounters with bears, lightning strikes that had split trees beside him, and snowstorms that had threatened to bury him alive, he'd never felt the kind of primitive terror that now gripped him. This wasn't natural fear, it was something deeper, older. A recognition that he'd stumbled onto something that was never meant to be disturbed. The glow intensified, and with it came a new sound, not the steady humming he'd grown accustomed to, but a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks, like Morse code being tapped out by an invisible operator. The pattern was too complex to be random, too purposeful to be mechanical noise. Someone or something was responding to his excavation, acknowledging his presence, perhaps even trying to communicate. Bramble bolted. The dog shot through the underbrush toward home with a speed born of pure panic, crashing through deadfall and disappearing from sight. Elias found himself alone in the clearing, with whatever was awakening beneath his feet. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, and now Elias could see movement within the blue glow, shadows shifting deep underground, as if something large was stirring in the depths below the pipes. The rational part of his mind urged him to follow Bramble's example, to flee this place and never return. But 40 years of mountain living had also taught him that running blindly from danger was often more perilous than standing your ground. And trying to understand what you faced, he forced himself to approach the excavation once more, every instinct screaming against it. The clicking had evolved into something that almost resembled a pattern. 3 short clicks, 3 long ones, 3 short again. If it was a code, it was one he didn't recognize, but the repetition suggested intelligence, purpose, an attempt at contact. The blue glow pulsed brighter, and suddenly the clicking stopped. In the profound silence that followed, Elias became aware of another sound. Footsteps approaching through the forest. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone moving with purpose through the undergrowth. But when he turned toward the sound, he saw nothing but empty trees and dappled shadows. The footsteps continued, circling the clearing now, always just beyond the edge of visibility. Elias grabbed his pack and tools, his hands shaking as he tried to secure his equipment. Whatever was down there had been waiting for someone to find it, and now that someone had arrived, things were being set in motion that he didn't understand and couldn't control. As he hurried from the clearing, the blue glow faded behind him, but the clicking resumed, following him through the forest like an electronic heartbeat. By the time he reached his cabin, the sound had embedded itself so deeply in his consciousness that he wasn't sure if he was still hearing it or simply remembering it. One thing was certain: his quiet life on the mountain would never be the same. The pipes had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the earth, and now both he and whatever lay below were committed to seeing this mystery through to its conclusion, wherever that might lead. Sleep eluded Elias that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blue glow pulsing beneath the earth, felt the vibration of those mysterious clicks reverberating through his bones. Bramble had returned to the cabin just after sunset, slinking through the door, with his tail between his legs, and refusing to meet Elias's eyes. The dog had positioned himself as far from the direction of the pipes as possible, curled into a tight ball beside the cold fireplace. By dawn, Elias had made his decision. He needed help, and there was only one person in these mountains whose wisdom he trusted completely. Joe Whitehorse lived in a modest ranch house in the valley below, where the meadow grass grew thick and the creek spread wide and shallow across smooth stones. At 72, Joe moved with the careful dignity of a man who'd learned to read the world through more than just his eyes. His great-grandfather had been present at the Little Bighorn, and his family had maintained an unbroken connection to these lands that stretched back centuries before the first European settlers arrived. The drive down the mountain road took Elias nearly 2 hours, navigating switchbacks that had been carved from the rock face by Depression-era work crews. His old Ford pickup handled the descent with the reliable stubbornness that had kept it running for 15 years, but Elias barely noticed the familiar scenery. His thoughts kept returning to those symbols wrapped around the pipes, the geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. He found Joe in his workshop, a converted barn where the old man practiced the traditional crafts that his grandfather had taught him. Joe was working on a piece of beadwork, his weathered fingers moving with practiced precision as he created intricate patterns in red and blue and white. The air smelled of sweet grass and leather, familiar scents that usually brought Elias comfort, but today seemed unable to penetrate his unease. "You look like a man who's seen something he wishes he hadn't," Joe said, without looking up from his work. It was typical of the old rancher to cut straight to the heart of matters. Elias settled into a chair across from his friend, searching for words to describe what he'd discovered. "Joe, in all the stories your people tell about these mountains, is there anything about things buried deep underground? Things that don't belong to any tribe or mining company?" Joe's fingers stilled on the beadwork. His dark eyes, still sharp despite his age, focused intently on Elias's face. "That's a specific question, my friend. What have you found up there?" Elias described the pipes, the symbols, the blue glow, and the clicking sounds. As he spoke, he watched Joe's expression grow increasingly grave. When he finished, the workshop fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the eaves. "My grandfather told stories," Joe said finally, setting aside his beadwork. "Stories that most of our people stopped believing generations ago. He spoke of the time before time, when others walked these lands. Not human others, but others nonetheless. He said they left things behind when they departed, things that were meant to stay hidden until the world was ready for them." "What kind of things?" Joe stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the workshop. From it he retrieved a small object wrapped in deerskin. "My grandfather found this when he was young, hunting near what you white folks call Glacier Lake. He never told anyone, except family, about it. The unwrapped object was a disc about the size of a silver dollar, made from the same strange metal as the pipes. It bore similar geometric symbols etched with precision into its surface. Like the bands around the pipes, the metal was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm. "The symbols," Elias whispered, running his finger along the etched patterns. "They're exactly like what I found. My grandfather believed these were markers," Joe explained. "Warnings, maybe, or instructions? He said the old stories spoke of a great sleeping beneath the mountains, something that would wake when the proper signs appeared. Most of our elders dismiss such talk as superstition, but my grandfather insisted the stories contained truth." Elias studied the disc, noting how the symbols seemed to rearrange themselves when viewed from different angles. "Did your grandfather ever say what was supposed to wake up?" "No, but he said when it happened the world would change. Whether for better or worse would depend on who found the markers first and what they chose to do with them." Joe re-wrapped the disc and returned it to the chest. "There's something else. About 3 weeks ago, I started having dreams. The same dream, night after night. I'm standing on a mountainside, and the earth is glowing blue beneath my feet. I can hear singing, but it's not human voices. It's something else, something old and powerful, and not entirely friendly. A chill ran down Elias's spine. The glow was blue, exactly like in your dream. Then it started, Joe said quietly. Whatever my grandfather's stories warned about, it's beginning to wake up. They spent the rest of the morning going through Joe's collection of family artifacts and written records. Among his grandfather's papers, they found sketches of symbols that matched those on the pipes, along with hand-drawn maps marking locations throughout the mountain range where similar discoveries might be found. According to the notes, the pipes Elias had uncovered were just one part of a much larger network that extended deep underground across hundreds of square miles. "Look at this," Joe said, pointing to a passage written in his grandfather's careful script. He writes about the watchers below and the time of choosing. He believed that whoever found the markers would have to make a decision, whether to dig deeper and awaken what lay beneath, or to leave things buried and preserve the current order of the world. What did he think the right choice was? Joe shook his head. He died before he could decide, but he left instructions. If the markers were ever found, the finder should gather the other families who had knowledge of the old stories. Together, they could make the choice that would affect everyone. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, Elias felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy pack. He'd spent 40 years seeking solitude in the mountains, avoiding the complications that came with human society. Now he found himself at the center of something that could impact far more than just his own quiet life. Who else knows these stories? He asked. Martha Crenshaw's husband was part Crow. Her family might have records. And there's an old trapper named Samuel River who lives up near the Canadian border. His grandmother was Salish, and their stories often intersect with ours. Joe walked Elias to his truck as the sun began to sink behind the western peaks. Be careful, my friend. Some things are buried for good reasons. But if you're determined to pursue this, don't go alone. And remember, whatever you wake up down there, you'll be responsible for dealing with it. As Elias drove back up the mountain road, Joe's disc hidden in his jacket pocket, he couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond his understanding were already in motion. The blue glow hadn't been random. It had responded to his presence, acknowledged his discovery. Something that had slept beneath the earth for unknown ages was stirring, and he was the one who had disturbed its rest. The question now was whether he had the courage to see this through to whatever end awaited, and whether that end would justify the risks he was about to take. Martha Crenshaw lived 8 miles north of Elias's cabin, in a weathered log house that her husband had built with his own hands 43 years ago. She was tending her late-season garden when Elias arrived the next morning, pulling the last of the winter squash from vines that had already been touched by frost. At 68, Martha possessed the kind of practical resilience that mountain living demanded. But Elias could see the loneliness in her eyes that had settled there since her husband Robert's passing 3 years earlier. "Elias McCready," she called out, straightening with a slight grimace as her back protested. "Don't often see you making social calls. Something must be weighing on your mind." Elias helped her carry the squash to her root cellar, a stone-lined excavation that Robert had dug into the hillside behind the house. As they worked, he carefully broached the subject of old stories and family histories. Watching Martha's expression for any sign of recognition, Robert used to tell tales his grandmother passed down, Martha said finally, settling into a rocking chair on her covered porch. Most of them, I figured, were just entertainment, but there were some that seemed different, more serious, if you know what I mean. She disappeared into the house and returned with a wooden box that bore the carved symbols of Crow tribal artistry. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, was a collection of items that made Elias's pulse quicken. Among them was a small metal cylinder, barely larger than a pencil, made from the same strange alloy as the pipes he'd discovered. Robert's grandmother gave him this when he was just a boy, Martha explained. She told him it was a key to something important, but she died before she could explain what it was meant to unlock. Robert always figured it was just an old story, something to keep children entertained on winter nights. The cylinder was covered with the same geometric symbols, etched in spiraling patterns around its surface. When Elias held it up to the light, he could see that it was hollow, and something inside it rattled softly when moved. More significantly, the metal was warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with the same rhythm he'd felt in the pipes. "Martha, has anything unusual happened around here lately? Strange sounds, animals acting peculiar, anything out of the ordinary?" She considered the question seriously. "Now that you mention it, my chickens have been acting skittish for the past week or so. Won't go into their coop after dark, and they keep looking up at the sky like they're expecting something to come down out of it. And old Blue, that's my barn cat, he's been hiding under the porch and won't come out, not even for his favorite treats." Elias felt the familiar chill of recognition. Animals possessed instincts that humans had dulled through generations of civilized living. If Martha's animals were displaying the same anxiety he'd observed in Bramble, it suggested that whatever was awakening beneath the mountain was affecting a much larger area than just the site of his discovery. "There's something else," Martha continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "3 nights ago I woke up to the strangest sound. It was like singing, but not human voices, more like wind instruments, but playing notes that didn't seem to follow any music I'd ever heard. It came from underground, Elias, I'm certain of it. The sound was rising up through the floorboards of my bedroom. How long did it last? Maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had started. I've been sleeping in the front room ever since. Can't bring myself to go back in that bedroom." Elias examined the other items in Martha's box. There were old photographs, handwritten letters in a language he couldn't identify, and several more metal objects that bore the same mysterious symbols. One item in particular caught his attention, a hand-drawn map that showed the local mountain range with various locations marked by the geometric symbols he'd come to recognize. Did Robert ever say what these marked locations were supposed to represent? Underground chambers, according to his grandmother's stories. She claimed there was a whole network of them connected by tunnels that ran deeper than any mine ever dug. She said they were built by the people who came before, and that someday someone would need to open them all at the same time. The implications of what Martha was describing made Elias's head spin. If the stories were true, then his discovery of the pipes was just the beginning. There could be dozens of similar sites throughout the mountain range, all connected, all part of some larger purpose that he was only beginning to understand. "Martha, I need to tell you what I found up on my property." He described the pipes, the excavation, and the mysterious blue glow that had responded to his digging. As he spoke, Martha's expression grew increasingly troubled. When he finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, rocking slowly back and forth while she processed what he'd told her. "Robert always said that if these old stories ever proved true, it would mean the end of the world as we know it," she said finally. "Not necessarily the end of everything, but the end of the way things have always been. He believed that whoever found the first marker would become responsible for deciding what came next. What did he think should be done? He never said. I think he hoped he'd never have to make that choice." Martha looked directly at Elias, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "But if Robert were here now, I know he'd say that running away from responsibility isn't the same as avoiding it. Sometimes the harder path is the only one that leads to where you need to go." As Elias prepared to leave, Martha pressed the metal cylinder into his hands. "Take this. If it really is a key like Robert's grandmother claimed, then it belongs with whatever you found up there." The drive back to his cabin gave Elias time to consider the growing weight of evidence. 2 separate families, from different tribal backgrounds, had preserved stories and artifacts that all pointed to the same conclusion. Something significant lay buried beneath these mountains, and its awakening was somehow connected to his generation. His time, his choice. By the time he reached home, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Bramble greeted him at the door, But the dog's usual enthusiasm was tempered by an anxiety that seemed to grow stronger each day. As Elias prepared a simple dinner, he found himself listening for sounds that didn't belong, the clicking patterns he'd heard at the excavation site, the underground singing that Martha had described, any indication that whatever was stirring beneath the earth was continuing to awaken. Outside, the mountain night settled around his cabin with its familiar symphony of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of owls. But beneath those natural sounds, almost at the edge of hearing, Elias thought he could detect something else, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the mountain had developed a heartbeat that was slowly growing stronger. The third member of their unlikely alliance arrived on Elias's doorstep 2 days later, just as the first snow of the season began to dust the higher elevations. Billy Morrison drove up the mountain road in a battered Jeep that looked like it had survived several wars, its engine coughing and backfiring in the thin air. At 32, Billy possessed the restless energy of a man still running from something. Though in 5 years of occasional encounters, Elias had never pressed him about what that something might be. "Joe Whitehorse sent me," Billy said without preamble, stamping snow from his boots on Elias's porch. "Said you might need someone who knows how to handle complicated situations. Also said you found something that's got the old-timers worried." Elias studied the younger man's face, noting the intelligence behind eyes that had seen more trouble than most folks encountered in a lifetime. Billy carried himself with the coiled awareness of someone accustomed to danger, and his hands bore the kind of scars that came from work that went beyond simple mountain living. "What exactly did Joe tell you?" "Enough to know that you've stumbled onto something connected to the old stories. Enough to know that whatever's down there is starting to wake up." Billy's expression grew serious. "And enough to know that you're going to need help dealing with whatever comes next." Over coffee and Martha's fresh-baked bread, Elias filled Billy in on everything he'd discovered. The younger man listened without interruption, occasionally asking questions that revealed a surprising familiarity with the tribal stories and their implications. When Elias finished, Billy reached into his jacket and produced an object that made the older man's breath catch. It was a metal rod about 18 inches long, inscribed with the same geometric symbols that were becoming increasingly familiar. But this artifact was different. It hummed with its own internal energy, and the symbols along its length pulsed with a faint blue glow that matched what Elias had seen emanating from the pipes. "Found this 3 years ago, buried in a rock slide up near Copper Creek," Billy explained. "Figured it was just old mining equipment until last week, when it started doing this." He gestured to the pulsing glow. "Joe says it's responding to whatever you uncovered. Says the old stories claim that when all the artifacts start glowing at once, it means the time for choosing has arrived." Elias felt the weight of destiny settling around him like a heavy cloak.
"How many more of these things are out there?"
"According to Joe's research, maybe a dozen. Martha's cylinder, my rod, Joe's disc, and the pipes you found. But there could be others, scattered among families who've forgotten what they mean, or people who found them and never understood their significance." Billy set down his coffee and leaned forward. "Here's what I think we're dealing with. The stories all point to some kind of ancient technology, something that was deliberately buried and left with instructions for future generations. The artifacts aren't just markers, they're components of a larger system. And that system is designed to activate when specific conditions are met. What kind of conditions? The right time, the right people, the right circumstances. Think about it. All 3 of us have roots in these mountains going back generations. We've all chosen to live apart from mainstream society. We've all been drawn to this mystery despite the obvious dangers. That's not coincidence. As if summoned by their conversation, the artifacts began to respond. Martha's cylinder, which Elias had placed on the kitchen table, started to emit the same blue glow as Billy's rod. The metal grew warm, then hot, and both objects began to vibrate with increasing intensity. Bramble bolted from his position by the fireplace, scratching frantically at the door, until Elias let him outside. Through the window, they could see the dog running in circles in the yard, whining and looking up at the sky as if expecting something to descend from the darkening clouds. "It's starting again," Elias said, remembering the response he'd triggered during his excavation. "Whatever's down there, it knows we're bringing the artifacts together." The humming sound that had become a constant background presence over the past week suddenly intensified. It rose from the floorboards, vibrated through the walls, and seemed to emanate from the earth itself. But now there was a new element, a rhythmic pattern that reminded Elias of a heartbeat, as if something massive was breathing in the depths below. Billy stood and moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for something concealed beneath his jacket. "We need to make a decision, and we need to make it soon. Whatever's down there is responding to our presence, getting stronger every time we bring the artifacts together. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right." Do what exactly? Complete the awakening. The stories all suggest that the process was designed to be gradual, controlled. But if we just walk away now, leave things half-finished, there's no telling what might happen. The system could activate on its own, without any human guidance or control. Elias felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had been growing heavier each day since his discovery. And if we do complete it, what then? Then we find out what our ancestors were trying to preserve for us. Could be knowledge, could be technology, could be something else entirely. But according to the stories, it's something that was meant to help humanity face a challenge that our predecessors knew was coming. The artifacts on the table were now glowing so brightly that they cast blue shadows on the cabin walls. The humming had evolved into something that almost resembled music, complex harmonies that seemed to speak directly to something deep in Elias's consciousness. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like listening to the song of something vast and alien, but not necessarily hostile. "There's something else you need to know," Billy said, his voice barely audible over the intensifying harmonies. "I didn't come up here just because Joe asked me to. I've been having dreams for the past month, the same dream over and over. I'm standing in a vast underground chamber filled with blue light, and there are others with me. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all working together on something important. In the dream, I can feel the weight of the mountain above us, but I'm not afraid. I feel like I'm finally where I belong." Elias met the younger man's eyes and saw his own mixture of fear and anticipation reflected there. "How do we know we're making the right choice?" "We don't, but we know that doing nothing is also a choice, and maybe not a safe one. The system is already activated. We can feel it responding to us. Our options now are to see it through to completion or to abandon it half-awakened and hope for the best." As they spoke, the blue glow from the artifacts began to pulse in rhythm with the underground harmonies, creating a hypnotic pattern that seemed to draw them deeper into the mystery they'd uncovered. Outside, the snow was falling harder, and Elias could see Bramble huddled against the cabin wall, his eyes fixed on something in the darkness that only he could perceive. The morning brought an eerie stillness to the mountain. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving a pristine white blanket that stretched unbroken from Elias's cabin to the distant peaks. But beneath the peaceful surface, changes were occurring that set all three men on edge. The artifacts had continued glowing through the night, their blue radiance visible even through the wooden box where Elias had attempted to contain them. More disturbing was the discovery that the glow was spreading. Faint luminescence now emanated from the metal fixtures in the cabin, the iron hinges on the doors, even the steel blade of Elias's hunting knife. Whatever energy was awakening below ground was affecting every piece of metal in the vicinity. Martha arrived just after sunrise, having made the difficult journey through the fresh snow in her late husband's old pickup truck. She carried with her a canvas bag containing additional artifacts that she'd found while searching through Robert's belongings. 3 more metal objects bearing the familiar geometric symbols, along with a leather-bound journal that her husband had kept hidden in their cellar. "I couldn't sleep," she explained. accepting a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The singing started again around midnight, louder this time. It was coming from everywhere, the walls, the floor, even the metal pipes under the kitchen sink. I had to get out of there. Billy examined the new artifacts while Elias studied Robert's journal. The handwriting was careful and precise, documenting decades of research into the tribal stories and their possible meanings. According to Robert's notes, the network of underground chambers extended throughout the entire mountain range, connected by tunnels that had been carved from the living rock with tools and techniques that exceeded anything known to modern engineering. "Look at this entry," Elias said, pointing to a passage dated just 2 years before Robert's death. He writes about electromagnetic anomalies, places where compasses spin wildly and electronic equipment fails. He mapped 17 different locations where these anomalies occur, and they correspond exactly to the sites marked on the tribal maps. Martha leaned over his shoulder to read her late husband's words. "He never told me about any of this. I knew he was interested in local history, but I had no idea he'd done this much research. According to this, your husband believed the anomalies were getting stronger," Billy observed, reading from another section of the journal. He documented increasing electromagnetic activity over the past decade, as if something underground was gradually powering up. The implications were staggering. If Robert's research was accurate, then the mountain range was sitting atop what amounted to a vast machine that had been dormant for unknown ages, but was now beginning to function again. The artifacts they'd collected weren't just historical curiosities, they were components of a control system that was designed to interface with whatever lay beneath. As they studied the journal, the assembled artifacts began to respond with increasing intensity. The blue glow brightened, the harmonic humming grew more complex, and new elements appeared, clicking patterns that reminded Elias of the sounds he'd heard during his excavation, but now arranged in sequences that suggested communication rather than random noise. "It's trying to tell us something," Martha said, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. "Those patterns, they're too organized to be accidental." Billy had been watching the artifacts with the focused attention of someone accustomed to reading signs and signals. "I think you're right. And I think I'm starting to understand what it's saying." He arranged the artifacts in a specific pattern on the table, positioning them according to the geometric relationships suggested by their symbols. As he did so, the humming intensified and the clicking patterns became more organized, evolving into something that almost resembled language. "The symbols aren't just decoration," Billy explained as he worked. "They're instructions, telling us how to arrange the components. Each artifact has a specific position in the overall pattern, and when they're properly aligned, he placed the final piece, Martha's cylinder, in the center of the arrangement. Immediately, the blue glow intensified to the point where they had to shield their eyes. The harmonic humming reached a crescendo that seemed to resonate in their bones, and then, suddenly, the sounds organized themselves into something unmistakably communicative. It wasn't speech as humans understood it, but it was definitely language, complex patterns of tone and rhythm that conveyed meaning on levels deeper than conscious thought. Images began to form in their minds, vast underground chambers filled with machinery that defied description, tunnels stretching for miles through the heart of the mountain, and at the center of it all, something that pulsed with intelligence and purpose. The vision lasted only moments, but it left all three of them shaken. They'd seen the scope of what lay beneath their feet. Not just buried artifacts or ancient ruins, but a functioning system of incredible complexity and power. And somehow, that system was aware of their presence and was attempting to communicate with them. "Did you see the chamber?" Martha whispered, her face pale with awe. "It was enormous, like a cathedral made of metal and crystal. And the machines," Billy added. "They were still running after all this time, waiting for someone to complete the connection." Elias felt the weight of understanding settling over him like a heavy blanket. The tribal stories hadn't been mythology after all. They had been historical records. passed down through generations to preserve knowledge of something that their ancestors had known would someday be needed again. The question is, he said slowly, what happens when we complete the connection? What is this system designed to do? Before anyone could answer, the artifact suddenly went dark. The blue glow faded, the humming stopped, and an oppressive silence settled over the cabin. Outside, they could hear Bramble barking frantically, and through the windows they saw him racing back and forth across the yard. His attention focused on something in the forest. Billy moved to the window and peered through the glass. "There's someone out there," he said quietly. 3 people, maybe 4, moving through the trees about 200 yards out. They're trying to stay hidden, but they're not doing a very good job of it. Elias felt his blood run cold. In 40 years of mountain living, he'd never had uninvited visitors approach his cabin with such obvious stealth. Who would know to come here? Who else knows about what we found? Maybe the same people who've been keeping these stories alive in other families, Martha suggested. Or maybe someone who's been watching for signs that the system was awakening. Billy's expression had hardened, and Elias noticed that the younger man's hand had moved instinctively toward whatever weapon he carried, concealed beneath his jacket. Or maybe someone who doesn't want the system to be activated. Someone who's been working to keep it buried. The implications of that possibility sent a chill through all of them. If there were people who knew about the underground network and were actively working to prevent its activation, then their small group might be in more danger than they'd realized. They weren't just dealing with ancient mysteries and alien technology. They might be caught in the middle of a conflict that had been going on for generations. The visitors emerged from the forest with their hands visible and empty, moving slowly to demonstrate peaceful intentions. Elias counted 4 figures, 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in the practical outdoor clothing of people who spent considerable time in the wilderness. But there was something about their bearing, their coordinated movement, that suggested they were more than casual hikers or lost tourists. The woman stepped forward as the group approached the cabin. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a practical braid and the kind of weathered features that spoke of decades spent outdoors. Her eyes were intelligent and alert, missing nothing as they took in the scene before her. "Mr. McCready," she called out when she was still 20 yards away. "My name is Dr. Sarah Blackwood. I'm with the National Geographic Society, and I believe we need to talk." Billy tensed beside the window. "National Geographic doesn't send armed teams into the wilderness," he muttered, nodding toward one of the men whose jacket bulged suspiciously around the shoulder area. Elias stepped onto his porch, keeping his hands visible but positioning himself where he could retreat quickly if necessary. "What brings National Geographic to my cabin, Dr. Blackwood?" "We've been monitoring electromagnetic anomalies in this region for the past 18 months, she replied, stopping at the edge of his yard. 3 days ago, our instruments detected a significant surge in activity centered on this location. We're here to investigate the source. And what makes you think I know anything about electromagnetic anomalies?" Dr. Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because our satellite data shows that the surge corresponds exactly with excavation activity on your property. Because we've traced similar artifacts to families throughout this mountain range, families who've maintained oral traditions about ancient technology buried beneath the earth. And because the electromagnetic signature we're detecting matches theoretical models for technology that shouldn't exist." Martha stepped out of the cabin behind Elias, followed by Billy. Dr. Blackwood's eyes immediately fixed on the younger man, and Elias saw recognition flash across her features. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "we've been looking for you for quite some time." Billy's hand moved toward his concealed weapon. "Have you now? And why would that be?" "Because 3 years ago, you disappeared from a classified research project with materials that belong to the United States government. Materials that we believe are connected to what Mr. McCready has discovered here." The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. Billy's artifact, the metal rod that had been responding to the underground system, it wasn't something he'd found by chance. It was stolen government property and Billy wasn't just a troubled young man seeking solitude in the mountains. He was a fugitive. "I think you'd better explain yourself," Elias said, looking between Billy and Dr. Blackwood. Billy's expression had gone hard as granite. "The project was called Deep Echo," he said finally. "Officially, we were researching earthquake prediction using ground-penetrating radar. Unofficially, we were mapping underground anomalies that the government had been tracking for decades." Dr. Blackwood nodded approvingly. "Mr. Morrison was one of our most valuable analysts until he developed moral objections to our research goals." "Moral objections to what?" "To weaponizing technology that was never meant for warfare," Billy replied, his voice tight with anger. "The government's been aware of the underground network for over 60 years. They've been systematically collecting artifacts, suppressing tribal stories, and working to ensure that the system never activates. Because they don't understand it," Dr. Blackwood added, "because it represents technology that could destabilize existing power structures, change the fundamental balance of global politics. The Pentagon's position is that unknown alien technology poses an unacceptable security risk." "Alien technology?" Martha's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Blackwood's smile returned, colder than before. "What did you think you were dealing with, Mrs. Crenshaw? Ancient human engineering. The geological surveys are quite clear. The underground network predates human civilization by several thousand years. The mathematical precision of the tunnel system, the metallurgy of the artifacts, the electromagnetic properties of the entire complex, none of it falls within the range of terrestrial technology." Elias felt the world shift around him as the implications sank in. The tribal stories, the buried chambers, the complex machinery, it was all the product of non-human intelligence. The artifacts weren't just ancient technology. They were alien technology, left behind by visitors who had departed long before humans developed civilization. "The question," Dr. Blackwood continued, "is what you intend to do with this knowledge. The system is clearly responding to your presence, becoming more active as you gather the artifacts. Our monitoring stations have detected increasing electromagnetic output from sites across the entire mountain range. Whatever the original builders intended, you've initiated the activation sequence." Billy stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on the grip of a pistol. "And your people want to shut it down before we can discover what it was meant to do. Our people want to prevent a potentially catastrophic release of unknown technology. The power levels we're detecting suggest that full activation could have effects far beyond this mountain range. We're talking about electromagnetic pulses that could disrupt satellite communications, interfere with power grids, possibly even affect weather patterns. Or it could be something beneficial," Martha interjected, "something that was left here to help us when we were ready for it." Dr. Blackwood shook her head. "We can't take that risk. Too much depends on maintaining the current order, the current balance of power. The decision has been made at the highest levels. The system must remain dormant. And if we refuse to cooperate," Elias asked, "then we'll be forced to take more direct action. The artifacts will be confiscated, the sites will be sealed, and anyone with knowledge of the network will be debriefed and relocated for their own protection." Billy laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Relocated. That's a nice way of saying imprisoned or eliminated." "This is bigger than any of us," Dr. Blackwood said, her voice taking on a tone of weary authority. "Personal preferences don't matter when global security is at stake." But even as she spoke, the artifacts inside the cabin began to glow again. The blue radiance was visible through the windows, and the harmonic humming resumed with greater intensity than before. It was as if the alien system was responding to the threat, preparing to defend itself against those who would keep it dormant. Dr. Blackwood's expression shifted to one of alarm as electromagnetic readings on her handheld device began climbing rapidly. "The activation sequence is accelerating," she said, speaking into a radio clipped to her collar. We need the suppression team here now. Suppression team! Elias felt ice forming in his stomach, electromagnetic pulse generators designed to disrupt the alien technology. If we can't convince you to cease your activities voluntarily, we'll have to shut down the entire network by force. Billy drew his weapon in one smooth motion, pointing it directly at Dr. Blackwood. I spent 3 years learning how that suppression technology works. It doesn't just disrupt the alien systems, it destroys them completely. You're not talking about temporary shutdown. You're talking about obliterating something that took an advanced civilization millennia to build. The standoff stretched taut as the blue glow from the cabin intensified and the harmonic humming evolved into something that sounded almost like voices, alien voices, speaking in frequencies that bypassed human ears and communicated directly with human consciousness. Elias could feel the intelligence behind those voices, vast and patient, but no longer passive. The system was fully awake now, aware of the threat it faced, and preparing to take action to protect itself. The choices had narrowed to a single, critical decision: allow the government to destroy the alien network and preserve the status quo, or fight to protect something that might represent humanity's next evolutionary step, even if that meant defying the most powerful forces on Earth. The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Billy's weapon remained trained on Dr. Blackwood, while her team spread out across Elias's yard, their own hands moving toward concealed firearms. Inside the cabin, the alien artifacts pulsed with increasing urgency, their harmonic voices growing more complex and insistent. Whatever intelligence lay beneath the mountain was clearly aware of the threat and was responding accordingly. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Blackwood said, her voice steady despite the gun pointed at her chest. "You have no idea what forces you're dealing with. The suppression team will be here within the hour, and they have authorization to use whatever force is necessary to contain this situation." "Then we don't have much time," Billy replied. He glanced at Elias without taking his eyes off the government team. "The activation sequence needs all the artifacts brought to the primary site, the pipes you discovered. If we can complete the connection before the suppression team arrives, the system might be able to defend itself." Martha clutched her husband's journal to her chest. Robert wrote about this possibility. He believed that once fully activated, the alien network would be able to project some kind of protective field, something that could neutralize electronic weapons and surveillance equipment. Dr. Blackwood's expression shifted to one of genuine alarm. "You're talking about activating a weapon system of unknown capability. The electromagnetic pulse alone could kill millions of people if it affects medical devices, air traffic control systems, or nuclear power plants. Or it could be exactly what humanity needs to take the next step in our development," Elias said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. For 40 years, he'd avoided making choices that affected anyone beyond himself. Now he found himself at the center of a decision that could change the course of human history. The blue glow from inside the cabin suddenly intensified, and the harmonic voices took on a new quality, urgent, almost pleading. Through the connection that had been growing stronger since his first contact with the pipes, Elias felt a flood of images and emotions that weren't entirely his own. He saw the Earth as it had been thousands of years ago, visited by beings whose technology was so advanced that they seemed like gods to early human observers. He felt their concern for the developing human species, their desire to leave behind tools and knowledge that would be available when humanity was ready to join a larger galactic community. And he sensed their hope that when the time came, humans would choose wisdom over fear, cooperation over conquest. "They were explorers," Elias said, his voice filled with wonder. "Scientists and teachers. They left the network as a gift, a way for us to communicate with other civilizations when we were ready. It's not a weapon, it's a communication system, a gateway to knowledge that could solve every problem we face." Dr. Blackwood shook her head. "That's exactly what they want you to believe. Alien contact scenarios always begin with promises of beneficial technology. But every analysis we've done suggests that the activation of this network would fundamentally alter human civilization in ways we can't predict or control. Maybe that's exactly what we need, Martha said quietly. Maybe the way we've been doing things isn't working anymore. Maybe it's time to try something different. Through the windows, they could see vehicles approaching up the mountain road, large, military-style trucks equipped with technology that Elias couldn't identify, but that made his skin crawl with foreboding. The suppression team was arriving ahead of schedule, and whatever equipment they carried was already affecting the electromagnetic environment. The harmonic voices from the artifacts were becoming distorted, breaking up like a radio signal, encountering interference. "We're out of time," Billy said. "If we're going to do this, it has to be now." Elias made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "Martha, gather all the artifacts." "Billy, how long do we need to reach the pipes and complete the activation?" "Maybe 20 minutes if we move fast. But those trucks will have teams that can track us through the forest. And they'll have equipment designed specifically to disrupt the alien technology. Then we'll have to make sure they can't follow us." Elias disappeared into his cabin and emerged with a hunting rifle and a backpack loaded with supplies. "I know these mountains better than anyone. If we can reach the network of old mining tunnels that run through the ridge above my excavation site, we can approach the pipes from underground." Dr. Blackwood took a step forward. "Mr. McCready, I'm begging you to reconsider the potential consequences. The potential consequences of doing nothing may be even worse," Elias interrupted. "Your government has been suppressing this technology for 60 years, while the world burns with wars, pollution, and inequality. Maybe it's time to let humanity choose its own path, instead of having that choice made for us by people in secret rooms." The lead truck had reached the bottom of Elias's driveway and was beginning the climb toward his cabin. Through binoculars, Billy could see soldiers deploying some kind of electronic equipment, devices that were causing the artifacts to flicker and dim as their electromagnetic field was disrupted. "Move," Billy commanded, and the three of them bolted from the cabin toward the tree line. They moved through the forest with desperate speed, Martha proving surprisingly agile for her age as she navigated fallen logs and rocky terrain. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of heavy equipment being unloaded from the trucks. The government team was professional and well-equipped, but they were operating on unfamiliar ground, while Elias was leading his companions through territory he'd known for 4 decades. The entrance to the old mining tunnels was hidden behind a screen of boulders and overgrown vegetation. Elias had discovered it years ago while hunting, exploring just far enough to determine that the tunnels connected to a network of natural caves that honeycombed the entire mountainside. What he hadn't known until this moment was that the tunnels would lead them directly to the underground chamber that housed the primary components of the alien network. "The artifacts are getting stronger," Martha observed as they entered the tunnel system. The metal objects in her pack were glowing brightly enough to illuminate their path, and the harmonic voices had resumed with renewed clarity, now that they were underground and shielded from the electromagnetic interference. The tunnels were older than Elias had initially realized. The stonework was too precise, too sophisticated for turn-of-the-century mining techniques. As they moved deeper into the mountain, following passages that seemed to lead directly toward the site of his excavation, he began to suspect that these weren't mining tunnels at all. They were part of the original alien construction, designed to provide access to the primary chamber. "Look at the walls," Billy said, running his hands over stone surfaces that bore the familiar geometric symbols. These weren't carved by human tools. The mathematical precision, the way the tunnels branch and converge, this is part of the same system as the pipes and artifacts. They emerged from the tunnels into a natural cavern that took their breath away. The space was enormous, easily large enough to house a cathedral, and it was filled with machinery that defied human understanding. Crystalline structures jutted from the floor and ceiling, connected by networks of the same metallic pipes that Elias had discovered on the surface. Everything pulsed with blue light that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, and the harmonic voices filled the space with complex melodies that spoke directly to their souls. At the center of the chamber, two familiar pipes emerged from the floor and disappeared into the ceiling, the same pipes that Elias had uncovered in the forest above. But here their true purpose was revealed. They were conduits, connections between the surface monitoring stations and the vast computational matrix that filled the underground space. "This is it," Martha whispered, her voice filled with awe. "This is what Robert spent his whole life trying to find." The artifacts in her pack were now glowing so brightly that they seemed to be on fire with blue flame. One by one, she removed them and placed them on a series of receptacles that seemed designed specifically for that purpose. As each artifact was connected, the chamber's energy level increased and new sections of machinery came online. "The surface team will find the tunnel entrance soon," Billy warned, checking his watch. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach us." But even as he spoke, it became clear that time was no longer their most pressing concern. The alien system was awakening fully now, responding to the presence of all its components in their proper configuration. The chamber filled with voices, not the harmonic tones they'd grown accustomed to, but actual communication. Intelligence, reaching across vast distances of space and time to make contact with three humans who had chosen to complete a connection that had been waiting for millennia. And in that contact, Elias finally understood what the alien visitors had really left behind. Not just technology, but an invitation to join something far greater than any of them had imagined. The moment the final artifact locked into place, reality shifted around them. The chamber exploded with light that transcended the visual spectrum, illuminating corners of consciousness that Elias had never known existed. The harmonic voices resolved into something that bypassed human language entirely, communicating in pure concepts and emotions that flooded their minds with understanding. He was no longer Elias McCready, mountain hermit. He was part of something vast and ancient, connected to intelligence that spanned galaxies and encompassed civilizations beyond human imagination. Through the network, he could feel the presence of other awakening nodes, similar chambers scattered across the Earth, each one responding to the activation signal that was now propagating through the planetary grid. "My God," Martha breathed, her consciousness expanding to encompass knowledge that her husband had spent decades trying to piece together from fragments and legends. She could see the true history of human development, the subtle guidance that alien visitors had provided throughout millennia, the careful preparation for this moment when humanity would be ready to join the galactic community. Billy's awareness shot through the network's defensive systems, understanding flooding through him as he recognized protocols he'd studied during his years with the Deep Echo project. The alien technology wasn't just communication equipment, it was a transformation system, designed to elevate human consciousness to a level where interstellar cooperation became possible. But their transcendent moment was shattered by the sound of explosions echoing through the tunnel system. The government suppression team had found the entrance and was blasting their way through the underground passages with military efficiency. "They're using shaped charges," Billy said, his enhanced awareness allowing him to track the team's progress through the mountain. "They'll reach us in less than 5 minutes. The chamber's defensive systems activated automatically, crystalline structures throughout the space beginning to hum with protective energy. But the alien network had been designed for cooperation, not warfare. Its shields could deflect natural electromagnetic interference, but they weren't intended to withstand a direct military assault. Through the network connection, Elias felt the presence of other awakening sites around the globe, installations in the Amazon rainforest, beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, hidden in mountain ranges from the Himalayas to the Rockies. All of them were responding to the activation signal, but all of them were also coming under attack by government forces that had been monitoring and preparing for this moment for decades. They're not just trying to stop us, Martha realized. Her consciousness linked to global communication networks through the alien system. They're attacking every site simultaneously. This is coordinated, planned. They've been waiting for someone to trigger the network so they could destroy it all at once. The first suppression team members appeared at the cavern entrance, their electronic equipment immediately disrupting the chamber's energy flow. Elias felt the network connection flickering, the vast intelligence that had welcomed them beginning to withdraw as interference patterns spread through the system. Dr. Blackwood entered behind her team, her face grim with determination. "Step away from the machinery," she commanded. "The suppression field is already active. Whatever connection you've established will be severed within minutes." But the alien intelligence wasn't passive in the face of destruction. As the government's electromagnetic weapons powered up, the network responded with countermeasures that its builders had included for exactly this scenario. The chamber filled with a deep thrumming sound, and every piece of electronic equipment the suppression team carried began to malfunction. "The system is adapting," Billy shouted over the increasing noise. "It's learning how to neutralize their technology in real time." The confrontation was escalating beyond what anyone had anticipated. What had begun as a simple suppression operation was turning into a technological war between human military equipment and alien defensive systems. The chamber's crystalline structures were overloading, their blue light flashing erratically as power levels fluctuated wildly. Through his connection to the network, Elias could feel the alien intelligence making a desperate decision. Rather than allow its gifts to humanity to be destroyed, it was preparing to implement a final protocol, a complete transformation that would elevate every human consciousness to its intended level. Whether humanity was ready or not, the chamber began to shake as enormous energies built up in the crystalline matrix. Equipment throughout the space was overloading, sparks flying from alien machinery that was being pushed far beyond its normal operating parameters. The government team was retreating toward the tunnel entrance as their electronic weapons became increasingly useless against the adaptive countermeasures. "It's going to transform everyone," Elias realized. His awareness expanded to global scale as he felt the network preparing to broadcast its consciousness, altering signal across the entire planet. Every human mind will be connected, elevated to the same level we've experienced here. The question now was whether humanity could survive such a radical transformation, or whether the shock of sudden evolutionary advancement would destroy the very species the alien visitors had tried to help. In the microseconds before the global transformation wave could launch, Elias made a choice that would define the future of human consciousness, drawing on 40 years of accumulated wisdom about respecting the mountain's rhythms and understanding when to push forward versus when to hold back. He reached through his network connection and touched the alien intelligence directly. What he communicated wasn't words or concepts, but something deeper, the hard-earned knowledge of a man who understood that forcing change, even beneficial change, often did more harm than good. The alien consciousness paused, its vast awareness focusing on the simple human thoughts that Elias offered. Through his mountain-born understanding of patience and proper timing, it began to comprehend something its builders had overlooked in their eagerness. To help humanity advance, that wisdom couldn't be imposed from the outside but had to be grown from within. Martha felt the shift through her own connection to the network. The building energies in the chamber stabilized as the alien intelligence reconsidered its approach. Instead of forcing transformation on every human mind simultaneously, it began to explore alternatives that honored the organic process of growth and choice. "It's listening to us," she whispered. her consciousness intertwined with both the alien intelligence and her companions. It's learning that readiness can't be forced. Billy, his awareness still tracking the government forces throughout the tunnel system, felt the suppression equipment suddenly lose power as the alien network withdrew its defensive energies. The electronic warfare that had been escalating toward mutual destruction simply stopped, leaving both sides in an unexpected stalemate. Dr. Blackwood stepped forward cautiously, her instruments showing that the dangerous energy levels in the chamber were dropping rapidly. What's happening? Why has the system shut down? Through the dimming network connection, Elias found words to explain what the alien intelligence had decided. It's choosing to wait, to let humanity come to this transformation naturally when we're truly ready for it, rather than forcing change that we might not be able to handle. The crystalline structures throughout the chamber were powering down, their blue glow fading to a soft phosphorescence that no longer threatened to overwhelm human consciousness. The artifacts that had triggered the awakening remained active, but at levels that allowed normal human awareness to coexist with expanded understanding. The network will remain available, Martha said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and profound sadness. Anyone who seeks the connection can find it, but it won't be imposed on those who aren't ready. The choice will be individual, personal, made when each person decides they want to explore what lies beyond normal human awareness. Dr. Blackwood's expression shifted from alarm to confusion. You're saying it's offering voluntary transformation? That people can choose whether to join this alien consciousness? Not alien consciousness, Billy corrected, his understanding of the network's true purpose now complete. Human consciousness expanded to its full potential. The network doesn't replace human thought, it amplifies it, connects it to a larger community of awareness that spans the galaxy. The government team was standing down, their mission parameters no longer applicable to a situation that had evolved beyond their contingency plans. The network posed no immediate threat to global security, but it also couldn't be suppressed or controlled through conventional means. This isn't over, Dr. Blackwood said, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. My superiors will want detailed reports about everything that's happened here. There will be investigations, classifications, attempts to study and potentially weaponize this technology. Let them try, Elias replied, feeling the network's patient strength still flowing through him. The system has been designed to resist misuse. It responds only to those who approach it with the right intentions, seeking growth and connection rather than power and control. As the immediate crisis passed, the three companions found themselves changed in ways they were only beginning to understand. The network connection hadn't been severed completely. It remained available as a background presence, ready to provide guidance and expanded awareness when needed. But it no longer overwhelmed their individual personalities or forced choices upon them. They had become bridges between two states of human existence: the isolated, competitive consciousness that had dominated human history and the connected, cooperative awareness that the alien visitors had tried to make available. Through their choice to respect humanity's right to grow at its own pace, they had earned something even more valuable than forced transformation. They had earned the trust of an intelligence vast enough to span galaxies, but wise enough to wait for invitation rather than forcing itself upon an unprepared species. The chamber was quiet now, its crystalline structures maintaining a gentle glow that would serve as a beacon for those ready to explore expanded consciousness. The network remained active but dormant, waiting for humanity to decide collectively when it was ready to take the next step in its evolutionary journey. And in that patient waiting, the true wisdom of the alien gift finally revealed itself, not just advanced technology, but the understanding that real growth could only come from choice, readiness, and the courage to reach for something greater when the time was truly right. 6 months after the awakening, Elias stood on his cabin porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose. The world looked the same as it always had, but everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Bramble sat beside him, no longer anxious about strange sounds from underground, but alert to new possibilities that seemed to whisper through the mountain air. The government had classified the entire incident, burying it under layers of bureaucracy and official denial. Dr. Blackwood's team had sealed the tunnel entrance with concrete and steel, posting warnings about unstable geology and dangerous gases. But they couldn't seal the network itself, couldn't erase the knowledge that now spread quietly through communities around the world. Word traveled in the way that important truths always traveled, through conversations between trusted friends, through stories shared around family tables, through the quiet recognition that passed between people who had touched something larger than themselves. The network remained patient, accessible to those who sought it with genuine intention, invisible to those who approached with conquest in their hearts. Martha had become something of an unofficial coordinator, her cabin serving as a meeting place for the growing number of people who had experienced the expanded consciousness and wanted to explore its implications. She'd preserved Robert's research while adding her own observations about the gradual changes occurring in those who maintained regular connection to the network. It's not about becoming something other than human, she often explained to newcomers. It's about becoming more fully human than we ever imagined possible. The network doesn't replace our individual consciousness. It shows us how individual awareness can contribute to something larger without losing its unique perspective. Billy had chosen a different path. His knowledge of government surveillance and suppression techniques made him valuable to the network's development in ways that went beyond simple consciousness expansion. He traveled frequently now, helping other awakening sites avoid the kind of military confrontation they'd experienced in Montana. His years of training in electronic warfare had found new purpose in protecting alien technology from those who would misuse it. The network learns, he reported during one of his visits to Elias's cabin. Every time the government tries to develop new suppression techniques, the system adapts. It's becoming increasingly difficult for them to locate and neutralize the active sites. But it's also becoming easier for genuine seekers to find what they're looking for. The changes in global consciousness were subtle but measurable. Conflict resolution improved in areas where network connections were strongest. Environmental restoration projects began succeeding at unprecedented rates as communities found ways to cooperate that transcended traditional political and economic boundaries. Scientific breakthroughs accelerated as researchers gained access to expanded awareness that revealed previously hidden connections and patterns. Not everyone welcomed these changes. There were those who saw the network as a threat to human independence, who feared that expanded consciousness might undermine the competitive individualism that had driven human development for millennia. Governments struggled to understand phenomena that couldn't be controlled through conventional means. Religious leaders debated whether the network represented divine gift or demonic temptation. But for Elias, the debates mattered less than the daily reality of living with expanded awareness. His morning routines remained largely unchanged. Coffee brewed strong and black, careful attention to the subtle signs that told him what the mountain needed from him each day. But now those observations carried deeper meaning, connected him to patterns of life and growth that extended far beyond his immediate environment. He still trapped and hunted, still maintained his garden and split his firewood, but the network had taught him to see these activities as part of a larger web of relationships that included not just the local ecosystem, but the planetary biosphere and the galactic community of consciousness that had welcomed Earth into its patient embrace. The artifacts remained active, their gentle blue glow visible in his cabin during the quiet evening hours when he sat reading or writing in his journal. They no longer hummed with urgent energy, but pulsed softly with the rhythm of deep contentment, like the breathing of something vast and peaceful that had finally found its proper place in the world. Joe Whitehorse, had passed away in his sleep 3 months after the awakening, but not before he'd had a chance to see his grandfather's stories validated and his family's long guardianship of ancient knowledge finally fulfilled. His funeral had been attended by representatives from dozens of tribes, many of whom brought their own artifacts and stories that were now recognized as part of the larger pattern of preparation that had been maintained across centuries. As the sun climbed higher and the morning air warmed, Elias felt the familiar tug of the mountain calling him to his daily wanderings. There were new places to explore now, sections of the underground network that had revealed themselves to those who approached with proper respect and understanding. Each discovery brought new insights about the beings who had left these gifts behind, and about the future that awaited humanity when it was ready to claim its place among the stars. But that future would come in its own time, at its own pace. The network had learned patience from its human partners, just as humans had learned connection from the alien intelligence. The transformation would continue, spreading through choice rather than compulsion, growing through understanding rather than force. Looking out at the familiar peaks that had sheltered him for 40 years, Elias reflected on how the search for solitude had led him to the deepest connection he'd ever experienced. Sometimes the most important journeys began not with a destination in mind, but with the simple courage to pay attention when the world offered something unexpected. The mountain kept its secrets still, but now those secrets were invitations rather than mysteries, opportunities for growth rather than puzzles to be solved. And in that transformation of mystery into invitation, Elias had found something he'd never known he was searching for, a sense of belonging that stretched from his own small cabin to the farthest reaches of the cosmos.